Hey guys, welcome back to another journey through history's smokier corners, where we explore the everyday lives of people who lived centuries before us. Tonight, we're answering a question you've probably never thought to ask. What was it actually like to get high in ancient China? And I don't mean the Hollywood version with opium dens and dramatic scenes. I mean the real experience. What did it feel like, taste like, look like when a Tang dynasty scholar consumed cannabis tea? Or when a Taoist alchemist carefully prepared consciousness-altering elixirs in mountain monasteries? Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your pillow, pull your blanket a little higher, and let your breathing slow to match the gentle rhythm of these words. We're going to explore what it was really like to experience altered states of consciousness in ancient China, not through the lens of modern understanding, but through the eyes of people who lived 2,000 years ago. So close your eyes, let your mind drift back through time, and imagine stepping into a world where medicine and mysticism intertwined, where getting high wasn't about recreation, but about reaching toward the divine. Picture this. It's the year 200 BCE during the Han Dynasty. You're walking through the narrow streets of Chang'an, the capital city, where over 400,000 people live behind high walls that stretch beyond the horizon. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense, roasted chestnuts, and something else, something herbal and slightly sweet that seems to emanate from every third doorway. These are the shops of the medicine sellers, and inside their wooden walls lies an entire universe of consciousness-altering substances that would make a modern pharmacist's head spin. Not because they were particularly potent by today's standards, but because the ancient Chinese approached intoxication as a sacred art, a pathway to enlightenment that required years of study and careful preparation. The shop owner, a thin man with a wispy beard and hands stained green from grinding herbs, greets you with a bow. His shelves stretch from floor to ceiling, filled with ceramic jars, each one carefully labelled with elegant calligraphy. The labels read like poetry: Cloudwalker's Friend, Dragon's Breath Powder, Immortal's Morning Tea. But these aren't whimsical names chosen for marketing appeal. Each one represents decades, sometimes centuries, of careful observation and experimentation. The ancient Chinese didn't stumble upon consciousness-altering substances by accident. They approached them with the same methodical precision they brought to astronomy, mathematics, and governance. The most common substance for achieving altered states wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't opium, which wouldn't become widespread in China for another 1,000 years. It wasn't alcohol, though rice wine certainly played its role. The most common mind-altering substance in ancient China was hemp, specifically cannabis sativa, which they called dama. But here's where it gets interesting. The ancient Chinese didn't smoke cannabis the way people do today. Smoking, as a method of consumption, was virtually unknown in ancient China. Instead, they ate it, drank it in teas, or burned it as incense in enclosed spaces, allowing the smoke to fill temple chambers during religious ceremonies. The preparation was an art form in itself. Cannabis seeds were ground into powder and mixed with wine, creating a bitter, earthy drink that was consumed slowly, reverently, often while reciting prayers or poetry. The effects, according to ancient texts, came on gradually, like the slow progression of dawn across a mountain landscape. Hemp wasn't just used recreationally, if we can even call it that. In ancient Chinese medicine, it was prescribed for a staggering array of conditions: menstrual pain, rheumatism, malaria, constipation, and what they called absent-mindedness. The idea that absent-mindedness could be cured by a substance that modern people associate with causing absent-mindedness reveals just how different ancient Chinese thinking was from our own. They believed that cannabis didn't make the mind foggy, it made it clear. Not clear in the sense of sharp focus that we might associate with caffeine, but clear in the sense of transparent, like still water that allows you to see all the way to the bottom of a deep lake. The Shen Nong Ben Qiao Jing, one of the earliest Chinese pharmacological texts, describes cannabis as having the ability to communicate with spirits and lighten the body. This wasn't metaphorical language. Ancient Chinese practitioners believed that cannabis literally made the physical body lighter, allowing the soul to separate more easily and travel to other realms. Imagine being an ancient Chinese scholar, sitting in a small, sparsely furnished room with paper windows that filter the afternoon sunlight into a soft, golden glow. You've just consumed a carefully measured amount of cannabis tea, prepared according to a recipe passed down through generations of your family. The tea is bitter, earthy, with notes of ginger and honey added to make it more palatable. You sit in meditation posture, breathing slowly, waiting. The effects don't hit you like a sudden wave. Instead, they creep in like fog rolling over a hill, so gradually that you're not entirely sure when they begin. First, there's a subtle change in the quality of light coming through the windows. It seems warmer, more alive somehow. Then the sounds from the street outside, the creaking of cartwheels, the calls of vendors, the laughter of children, begin to seem more musical, as if the entire city has become a vast orchestra. But this is just the beginning. The real purpose of cannabis consumption in ancient China wasn't to achieve these mild perceptual changes. It was preparation for something much more profound, the attempt to achieve what they called Shen Xian, literally, spirit immortal, a state of consciousness where the boundaries between self and universe dissolve entirely. As night falls over ancient China, we turn our attention to a group of people who took consciousness-altering substances more seriously than perhaps any other culture in human history: the Taoist alchemists. These weren't wild-eyed experimenters throwing random herbs into a pot and hoping for the best. They were methodical scientists, philosophers, and mystics who spent their entire lives studying the relationship between matter and consciousness. Picture a Taoist monastery nestled high in the mountains of Sichuan province. The building is simple: wooden beams, tile roofs, courtyards filled with carefully tended gardens, where specific herbs are grown according to lunar cycles and seasonal changes. The monks here aren't just religious practitioners, they're researchers conducting experiments that won't be understood by Western science for another 1500 years. The head alchemist, Master Liu, is 73 years old, though he looks much younger. His hair is white but full, his back straight, his eyes clear and bright. He's spent the last 50 years of his life studying what he calls the great work, the transformation of base consciousness into enlightened awareness through the careful application of mineral and plant medicines. Master Liu's laboratory is unlike anything you've ever seen. Shelves line the walls, filled with hundreds of small ceramic bottles, each containing a different substance: powdered cinnabar, liquid mercury, dried mushrooms, crystallized honey, ground pearls, essence of pine resin. In the center of the room stands a furnace, not for melting metals, but for creating what the Taoists called elixirs of immortality. These weren't potions designed to make the physical body live forever, despite what later legends would claim. The Taoist alchemists were too sophisticated to believe in literal physical immortality. Instead, they were trying to create substances that would allow consciousness to transcend the limitations of ordinary perception, to experience what they called the Tao, the underlying principle that governs all existence. The process of creating these elixirs was incredibly complex, often taking months or even years. It began with meditation. Master Liu would spend days in contemplation, consulting ancient texts, observing the movements of stars and planets, waiting for what he considered the most auspicious moment to begin his work. Once the timing was right, he would begin gathering ingredients. This wasn't simply a matter of collecting herbs from the monastery garden. Each substance had to be harvested at a specific time. Certain mushrooms only during the new moon, particular flowers only at dawn, some minerals only after winter storms. The Taoists believed that the consciousness-altering properties of substances were directly connected to the cosmic conditions under which they were gathered. The actual preparation involved a process called cyclical distillation, heating, cooling, and reheating substances through multiple cycles, each one designed to concentrate and purify their psychoactive properties. The furnace would burn for days at a time, tended constantly by apprentice monks who maintained precise temperatures through careful management of airflow and fuel. But here's what made Taoist alchemy truly unique. The substances themselves were only half the equation. The other half was the state of mind of the person consuming them. The Taoists believed that consciousness-altering substances were tools, not magic. They could open doors, but the person still had to choose to walk through them. Master Liu would prepare his disciples for weeks before they consumed any alchemical preparation. This preparation involved fasting, meditation, study of ancient texts, and what they called ethical purification, a process of examining one's motivations, fears, and desires until the mind was as clear as possible. When the day finally came to consume the elixir, it was treated as a sacred ceremony. The disciples would gather in the monastery's main hall just before dawn. Incense would be lit, not the sweet-smelling sandalwood used in temples, but a mixture of herbs chosen specifically for their ability to calm the mind and open perception. Master Liu would present the elixir in a small jade cup. The liquid inside might be golden, silver, or deep red, depending on the ingredients used. The taste was always challenging, bitter, metallic, earthy, because the Taoists believed that anything truly transformative should require effort and commitment. The effects, when they came, were unlike anything experienced with simple cannabis consumption. Disciples reported visions of celestial realms, conversations with immortal beings, and experiences of merging completely with the natural world around them. But these weren't hallucinations in the modern sense. The Taoists saw them as glimpses of reality normally hidden from ordinary consciousness. One disciple, whose experience was recorded in a text from the 3rd century CE, described consuming a cinnabar-based elixir and suddenly being able to see the golden threads that connect all living things. He watched these threads pulse with light, carrying information between trees, animals, and humans. He realized that what he normally thought of as separate objects were actually parts of a single, vast organism. Another disciple wrote about experiencing time differently after consuming what was called the purple gold elixir. Instead of time flowing forward in a straight line, he perceived it as a spiral, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. He could see his own life from birth to death as a single, complete pattern, like viewing an entire river from high above, instead of just the section where he happened to be standing. But the Taoist alchemists weren't just interested in individual enlightenment. They believed that achieving these altered states of consciousness was a service to the entire universe. According to their philosophy, when one person transcended ordinary awareness, it created ripples that helped elevate the consciousness of everyone around them. As morning light filters through the mist over the Forbidden City, we turn our attention to how consciousness-altering substances were used at the very pinnacle of Chinese society, the imperial court. Here, among emperors and empresses, concubines and eunuchs, courtiers and scholars, getting high wasn't just permitted, it was often required. The Emperor Wudi of the Han dynasty, who ruled from 156 to 87 BCE, was particularly fascinated by substances that could alter consciousness. But his interest wasn't recreational. Woody was obsessed with what he called the great questions, the nature of reality, the possibility of immortality, and the relationship between earthly power and cosmic harmony. In the gardens behind his palace, Woody maintained what was essentially the world's first government-sponsored psychedelic research facility. Here, court alchemists, Taoist philosophers, and Buddhist monks from distant lands gathered to experiment with consciousness-altering substances under imperial protection. The gardens themselves were designed to enhance altered states of consciousness. Winding paths led visitors through carefully orchestrated environments, bamboo groves that filtered sunlight into dancing patterns, water features that created subtle, hypnotic sounds, plantings of herbs that released specific scents when touched by the wind. At the centre of the garden stood the Palace of Celestial Clarity, a building designed according to principles that wouldn't be understood by Western psychology for another 2,000 years. The proportions of the rooms, the colours of the walls, even the arrangement of furniture were all calculated to create what modern researchers would call set and setting, the psychological and physical environment that shapes the experience of consciousness-altering substances. Emperor Woody's court alchemist, a mysterious figure known only as Master Dongfang, had developed what he called the 5-element elixirs, preparations based on the traditional Chinese elements of wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Each elixir was designed to produce a different type of altered consciousness, corresponding to different aspects of imperial responsibility. The wood elixir, made primarily from pine resin and bamboo extracts, was said to enhance creativity and flexibility of thought. Woody would consume this before making decisions about new laws or administrative reforms. Court records describe him becoming unusually open to advice from subordinates, willing to consider ideas that would normally seem too radical or unconventional. The fire elixir, containing cinnabar and other mineral substances, was reserved for times of war or crisis. It allegedly increased courage and clarity of purpose, while reducing fear and hesitation. Before important military campaigns, Woody would consume this preparation and then spend hours in meditation, visualizing the movements of armies and the flow of battle. The earth elixir was perhaps the most interesting from a modern perspective. Made from fermented grain alcohol infused with mushrooms and ground pearls, it was designed to enhance what the Chinese called emotional intelligence, the ability to understand and influence the feelings of others. Woody would take this before important court ceremonies or diplomatic meetings, claiming it allowed him to see through deception and understand the true motivations of those around him. The metal elixir, containing mercury and other metallic compounds, substances we now know to be highly toxic, was supposed to sharpen analytical thinking and memory. Court scholars would sometimes be given small amounts before important examinations or when tasked with composing complex poetry or philosophical treatises. The water elixir was the most mystical of the 5. Made from the substances gathered during specific lunar phases and mixed with water from sacred mountain springs, it was said to dissolve the boundaries between self and cosmos, allowing the user to experience unity with the Tao. Woody reserved this for his most private spiritual practices, consuming it alone in a specially prepared chamber, where he would sit in meditation for hours, sometimes entire days. But the imperial use of consciousness-altering substances wasn't limited to the emperor himself. The entire court culture was permeated with what we might call controlled intoxication. Palace parties often featured wines infused with herbs that produced mild euphoria and enhanced sociability. Court poets were famous for composing verses while under the influence of various plant preparations, believing that altered consciousness allowed them to access deeper levels of creativity and insight. One of the most famous examples is the poet Li Bai, who lived during the Tang dynasty, 701 to 762 CE. Li Bai was renowned for his ability to compose brilliant poetry while heavily intoxicated, though his preferred substance wasn't what modern people might expect. Rather than simple alcohol, Li Bai consumed what he called liquid jade, a preparation made from rice wine infused with morning glory seeds, chrysanthemum flowers, and powdered deer antler. Li Bai's poetry, composed under the influence of these substances, was considered some of the finest in Chinese literature. His verses describe experiences of floating above mountains, conversing with immortal beings, and seeing the moon as a jade disk that could be plucked from the sky and held in one's hand. These weren't just fanciful metaphors, they were attempts to describe actual perceptual experiences induced by his consciousness-altering preparations. The imperial court's relationship with these substances was carefully regulated through a complex system of protocols and permissions. Only certain people were allowed to prepare consciousness-altering elixirs. Only specific occasions were considered appropriate for their use. And the experiences themselves were often recorded in detail by court scribes, creating an archive of consciousness exploration that has no parallel in any other ancient civilization. As the sun reaches its zenith over ancient China, casting sharp shadows in temple courtyards across the land, we encounter another fascinating aspect of consciousness alteration in ancient Chinese culture: the Buddhist approach to mind-altering substances. Unlike the Taoists, who saw these substances as tools for cosmic exploration, or the imperial court, which used them for governance and creativity, the Buddhists had a much more complex and nuanced relationship with consciousness-altering plants and preparations. In a monastery in the mountains near modern-day Xi'an, the head abbot, Venerable Jije, sits in his simple quarters, contemplating a question that had puzzled Buddhist practitioners for centuries. If the goal of Buddhist practice is to achieve clarity of mind and liberation from suffering, what role, if any, should consciousness-altering substances play in that process? The answer, as with most things Buddhist, was complicated. On one hand, the Buddha had warned against intoxication, listing it among the precepts that monks and serious practitioners should avoid. On the other hand, many of the herbs and preparations used in traditional Chinese medicine, herbs that Buddhist monasteries had used for healing purposes for hundreds of years, had consciousness-altering properties. Venerable Jije had spent decades studying this apparent contradiction. His conclusion was that the key lay not in the substances themselves, but in the intention behind their use. If a plant preparation was used to escape from reality, to avoid dealing with life's difficulties, or simply for pleasure, then it was contrary to Buddhist teaching. But if the same preparation was used as medicine, to heal the body so that the mind could function more clearly, or as a tool for deepening meditation and understanding, then it could be consistent with the Buddhist path. This distinction led to the development of what Buddhist practitioners called wisdom medicines, carefully prepared plant substances used not for intoxication, but for healing and spiritual development. These preparations were fundamentally different from both the Taoist elixirs and the imperial court's recreational substances. The most common wisdom medicine was a preparation made from the root of the plant Gastrodia elata, known in Chinese as Tianma, or heavenly hemp. Despite its name, this plant is not related to cannabis. Instead, it's a type of orchid that grows parasitically on the roots of other plants in dense mountain forests. When properly prepared, Tianma produces subtle effects on consciousness, not the dramatic visions reported by Taoist alchemists, but a gentle calming of mental chatter and enhancement of concentration. Buddhist monks would consume Tianma tea before long meditation sessions particularly during winter retreats, when practitioners would sit in meditation for hours at a time in unheated halls. The tea helped quiet what Buddhists call monkey mind, the constant stream of thoughts, worries and distractions that normally occupy human consciousness. Another important Buddhist consciousness-altering substance was derived from the reishi mushroom, known in Chinese as lingji, or spiritual mushroom. Unlike the more dramatic psychoactive mushrooms used by Taoist alchemists, reishi produces very subtle effects, a sense of calm alertness, improved ability to focus, and what practitioners described as emotional equilibrium. Reishi was particularly valued during what Buddhists called retreat from the world periods, when monks would spend months in solitary meditation, eating minimal food and speaking to no one. Under these conditions, the subtle effects of reishi could make the difference between a successful retreat and one derailed by anxiety, depression, or mental instability. But perhaps the most interesting Buddhist approach to consciousness alteration involved the use of incense made from consciousness-altering plants. Rather than consuming these substances directly, practitioners would burn them during meditation, allowing the smoke to fill the meditation hall and affect everyone present simultaneously. The most prized incense was made from a combination of sandalwood, aloes wood, and small amounts of cannabis flowers. This mixture, when burned slowly on specially designed charcoal, produced effects that practitioners described as opening the heart and softening the barriers between self and other. During group meditation sessions, this incense would be lit at the beginning of the sitting period. As the meditation progressed and the smoke filled the hall, practitioners reported a gradual deepening of their meditative state. The boundaries between individual meditators seemed to soften, creating what they called Sangha mind, a collective consciousness where the wisdom and compassion of the group became greater than the sum of its parts. One of the most detailed accounts of this practice comes from the diary of a Japanese monk named Enin, who travelled to China in the 9th century CE to study Buddhist practices. Enin described participating in a meditation session at a mountain monastery where this special incense was used. As the sweet smoke began to rise from the brazier, I felt the usual agitation of my mind begin to settle. The various thoughts and concerns that had been troubling me, worries about my journey, doubts about my understanding of the Dharma, homesickness for Japan, all of these seemed to lose their grip on my attention. But more remarkable was what happened as the session continued. I began to feel a sense of connection with my fellow practitioners that went beyond ordinary sympathy or friendship. It was as if the boundaries of my individual self had become permeable, allowing the wisdom and compassion of the entire group to flow through me. When thoughts arose, they seemed to arise not just in my mind, but in the collective mind of all the meditators. When someone in the group experienced a moment of insight or clarity, I could feel it as if it were my own. And when someone struggled with difficulty or pain, the compassion of the entire group seemed to surround and support them. By the end of the session, which lasted several hours, I felt as though I had experienced a glimpse of what the Buddha called interdependence, the recognition that all beings are connected in a web of mutual causation and support. The Buddhist approach to consciousness-altering substances was always embedded in a larger framework of ethical conduct, mental training, and wisdom development. Unlike recreational use, which might focus primarily on the pleasant effects of these substances, Buddhist practice emphasized using any altered state of consciousness as an opportunity for insight into the nature of mind and reality. Practitioners were taught to observe their experiences carefully, noting how consciousness changed under the influence of these substances, but without becoming attached to any particular state or sensation. The goal was not to achieve a specific type of experience, but to develop the kind of clear, stable awareness that could remain present and observant regardless of what was happening in consciousness. As evening approaches and the first stars begin to appear over the Gobi Desert, our journey takes us along the legendary Silk Road, that network of trade routes that connected ancient China with Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Here in the caravanserais and trading posts scattered across thousands of miles of desert and mountain, we discover how consciousness-altering substances moved between cultures, creating a vast international exchange of knowledge about plants, preparations, and practices for altering human awareness. Picture a trading post in what is now Western China, near the modern border with Kazakhstan. The settlement consists of perhaps 20 buildings, clustered around a central courtyard, where caravans can rest and resupply. The air is dry and thin, carrying the scent of dust, animal sweat, and something else, the complex layered aroma of dozens of different herbs and medicines from across the known world. The traders who stop here aren't just carrying silk, spices, and precious metals. Hidden in their saddlebags, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in sealed ceramic containers, they carry what amounts to the ancient world's most comprehensive pharmacy of consciousness. Altering substances, cannabis seeds from the Hindu Kush mountains, opium resin from Persia, psychoactive mushrooms preserved in honey from the steppes of Central Asia, sacred plants from Tibet whose names are known only to mountain shamans. The trading post's pharmacist, a weathered man named Abul Qasim, who speaks 7 languages and has travelled from Spain to Beijing, maintains careful records of every substance that passes through his establishment. His records, written on strips of bark and stored in leather tubes, represent one of the world's first international pharmacopoeias. Abul Qasim's notes describe not just the substances themselves, but the different ways various cultures prepare and use them. The same cannabis plant that Chinese Taoists brewed into tea, Persian Zoroastrians burned as sacred incense, while Central Asian shamans mixed with fermented mare's milk to create a mildly psychoactive beverage used in healing ceremonies. One of the most fascinating aspects of Silk Road consciousness research was how different cultures' approaches to the same substance could produce completely different effects. Opium, for example, was known to Chinese, Persian, Arab, and European traders, but each culture had developed distinct methods of preparation and use that resulted in dramatically different experiences. The Chinese typically mixed opium with other herbs to create what they called dream pills, preparations designed to enhance sleep and produce vivid, meaningful dreams. These weren't intended for daily use, but were reserved for specific therapeutic purposes or spiritual practices. A Chinese trader suffering from chronic pain might take a dream pill before sleep, hoping to receive guidance about healing in his dreams. Persian traders, influenced by Zoroastrian religious practices, often combined opium with frankincense and myrrh to create incense used in fire temples. The smoke from this mixture was said to facilitate communication with Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrianism. Rather than producing the sedating effects associated with opium, this preparation was reported to enhance mental clarity and spiritual insight. Arab traders had developed perhaps the most sophisticated opium preparations, combining it with various plant alkaloids to create substances with highly specific effects. They had preparations that enhanced mathematical thinking, others that improved memory, and still others designed to produce what they called the state of the lover, a condition of heightened emotional sensitivity and appreciation for beauty. The Silk Road also facilitated the exchange of consciousness-altering substances that were unknown in their pure form to any single culture. Central Asian traders discovered that when they combined Chinese cannabis with Persian opium and Tibetan high-altitude herbs, the resulting preparation produced effects that none of the individual substances could achieve alone. These combination preparations were highly prized and often closely guarded secrets. A trader who discovered an effective new mixture could ensure his fortune for generations. The formula for one famous combination, known as merchant's wisdom, was said to enhance the ability to assess the quality and value of goods, making it invaluable for trade negotiations. The formula was passed down through only 3 trading families for over 4 centuries before finally being lost during the Mongol invasions. But the Silk Road pharmacies weren't just about buying and selling consciousness-altering substances. They also served as informal research centres where knowledge about these substances was shared, tested, and refined. Traders from different cultures would gather in the evening around the courtyard fires, sharing stories about their experiences with various preparations. These conversations led to a gradual convergence of understanding about consciousness-altering substances that transcended cultural and religious boundaries. Regardless of whether someone was a Chinese Taoist, a Persian Zoroastrian, or an Arab Muslim, certain principles emerged from this collective experimentation. First, the importance of set and setting, though they didn't use those terms. Traders learned that the same substance could produce completely different effects depending on the user's mental state and physical environment. A preparation that might produce spiritual insights when used in a quiet temple could cause anxiety or confusion when used in a noisy caravan camp. Second, the recognition that individual physiology played a major role in how consciousness-altering substances affected different people. What worked perfectly for one person might be ineffective or even harmful for another. This led to the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for assessing individual constitution and tailoring preparations accordingly. Third, the understanding that consciousness-altering substances were tools that required skill and training to use effectively. Simply consuming a plant or preparation wasn't enough. The user needed to learn how to navigate and interpret altered states of consciousness in order to derive benefit from them. As our journey continues westward along the Silk Road, we find ourselves in ancient Persia, in the great city of Isfahan, where the morning call to prayer echoes across domed rooftops, and the air shimmers with heat rising from brick-paved courtyards. Here, in one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world, we discover a completely different approach to consciousness alteration, one that would profoundly influence Islamic culture and eventually spread across 3 continents. In a narrow street near the Grand Bazaar, behind an unmarked wooden door, lies what locals call a house of contemplation. To the uninitiated, it appears to be simply a place where scholarly men gather to read, write, and discuss philosophy. But to those familiar with Persian mystical traditions, it represents something far more significant: a laboratory for exploring the relationship between consciousness, spirituality, and divine knowledge. The master of this house is Hakim al-Dimashqi, a physician, philosopher, and mystic who has spent the last 30 years studying what he calls the medicines of the soul. Unlike the Chinese, who approached consciousness-altering substances primarily through Taoist and Buddhist frameworks, or the Arabs, who integrated them into Islamic mystical practices, the Persians had developed their own unique synthesis based on Zoroastrian, Greek, and Islamic influences. Hakim al-Dimashqi's approach to consciousness alteration was fundamentally medical. He believed that just as the body could become ill and require treatment with herbs and minerals, the soul could also become imbalanced and require what he called spiritual medicines to restore its natural state of clarity and connection to the divine. The primary substance used in his house of contemplation was hashish, concentrated cannabis resin that had been carefully prepared according to techniques developed over centuries of Persian pharmaceutical tradition. But this wasn't the crude cannabis preparations used elsewhere in the ancient world. Persian hashish making was an art form that rivaled the finest perfumery or winemaking. The process began with cannabis plants grown in specific regions of Persia, where the combination of soil, climate, and altitude produced resin with optimal psychoactive properties. The plants were harvested at precise moments determined by astronomical calculations, then processed using techniques that concentrated the active compounds while preserving what Persian pharmacists called the spiritual essence of the plant. The resulting hashish was a dark aromatic substance with the consistency of soft wax. When properly prepared, a piece no larger than a grain of rice could produce consciousness-altering effects that lasted for several hours. But the Persians didn't simply consume this substance and wait for effects to occur. Instead, they had developed elaborate protocols for maximizing what they saw as its spiritual and intellectual benefits. A typical session in Hakim al-Dimashqi's House of Contemplation would begin in the late afternoon. Participants, usually no more than 6 or 7 men, all of whom had undergone months of preparation, would gather in a room specifically designed for the purpose. The space was simple but elegant: carpeted floors, cushions for seating, walls decorated with calligraphy featuring verses from Persian mystical poetry, and a small fountain in the centre that provided the gentle sound of flowing water. Before consuming any hashish, participants would engage in what they called preparation of the vessel, a series of practices designed to optimize their mental and spiritual state. This included ritual purification, recitation of specific prayers and verses, controlled breathing exercises, and meditation on particular philosophical concepts. The hashish itself was prepared fresh for each session. Hakim al-Dimashqi would heat a small amount over a charcoal brazier until it became soft and pliable. Then mix it with honey, ground almonds, and a carefully guarded combination of spices that he claimed enhanced its spiritual properties while reducing unwanted physical effects. Each participant received a portion appropriate to his level of experience and individual constitution. Beginners might receive an amount equivalent to half a grain of rice, while experienced practitioners could handle portions several times larger. The consumption itself was ritualized. The hashish was placed on the tongue and allowed to dissolve slowly, while the participant focused on specific breathing patterns and mental exercises. The effects typically began to manifest within 30 to 60 minutes. Persian texts describe the initial phase as the opening of the inner eye, a gradual shift in perception where ordinary objects and experiences began to reveal deeper layers of meaning and significance. Colours became more vivid, sounds more musical, and thoughts more fluid and interconnected. But the Persians weren't interested in these perceptual changes for their own sake. They saw them as a doorway to what they called the contemplative state, a condition of consciousness where the mind could engage with philosophical and spiritual questions in ways that were impossible during ordinary awareness. During the peak of the hashish experience, participants would engage in structured intellectual exercises. These might include contemplation of specific passages from Persian mystical literature, mathematical problems designed to explore the nature of infinity, or collaborative attempts to understand complex theological concepts. One particularly popular exercise involved what they called the game of divine names. Persian mystical tradition recognizes 99 names or attributes of the divine: compassion, wisdom, justice, beauty, and so forth. Under the influence of hashish, participants would select one of these names and spend hours exploring its meaning, discussing how it manifested in the natural world, in human relationships, and in their own inner experience. The conversations that emerged from these sessions were often transcribed by scribes and preserved in collections that were passed down through generations of Persian scholars. These texts provide fascinating insights into how consciousness-altering substances affected intellectual and spiritual discourse in the ancient world. One preserved dialogue, dating from approximately 800 CE, records a conversation between four scholars exploring the concept of divine beauty while under the influence of hashish. The discussion begins with relatively conventional observations about beauty in nature and art, but gradually evolves into increasingly sophisticated explorations of the relationship between beauty and consciousness, the role of perception in creating aesthetic experience, and the possibility that beauty might be a fundamental property of existence itself rather than simply a human projection. What's remarkable about these texts is their intellectual rigor. Despite being produced by people under the influence of consciousness-altering substances, they demonstrate sophisticated reasoning, careful attention to logical consistency, and deep familiarity with complex philosophical traditions. Rather than producing rambling or incoherent thought, the Persian approach to hashish seemed to enhance participants' ability to engage with abstract concepts while maintaining intellectual discipline. As our journey through the ancient world's consciousness-altering traditions carries us westward to the land of the pharaohs, we find ourselves standing before the great temple complexes of ancient Egypt, where the setting sun casts long shadows across hieroglyph-covered walls, and the air carries the scent of frankincense and myrrh. Here, in one of humanity's oldest and most sophisticated civilizations, consciousness alteration was woven into the very fabric of religious and social life. Unlike the individual mystical experiences sought by Chinese Taoists or the scholarly discussions of Persian hashish houses, the Egyptians approached consciousness alteration as a collective journey toward divine union. Their most important consciousness-altering substance was called kaife, a complex incense preparation that could take months to create, and was considered so sacred that its preparation was overseen by the pharaoh himself. Picture yourself in the temple complex at Dendera, dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of music, dance, and altered states of consciousness. The temple's inner sanctum is illuminated by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls covered with intricate paintings depicting the journey of the soul through the afterlife. The air is thick with the smoke of burning kaifi, creating an atmosphere that seems to exist somewhere between the earthly and divine realms. The high priestess, Nefertiti Karnith, has spent the last 20 years learning the secret arts of consciousness alteration from the temple's most experienced practitioners. Unlike the male-dominated traditions we've encountered in other cultures, Egyptian temple culture included many powerful priestesses who specialized in guiding others through altered states of consciousness. Kaifi itself was far more than just an incense. According to Egyptian texts, it was a complete pharmaceutical preparation containing 16 different ingredients, each carefully selected for its specific effects on consciousness, and each requiring different methods of preparation and purification. The complete recipe for kaifi was one of the most closely guarded secrets in ancient Egypt, known only to the highest-ranking temple priests, and recorded in hieroglyphs so complex that even today scholars debate their exact meaning. The base of kaifi consisted of honey and wine, but not just any honey and wine. The honey had to come from bees that fed exclusively on specific flowers blooming near sacred sites, and it had to be collected during particular lunar phases. The wine was made from grapes grown in temple vineyards and fermented in underground chambers where the temperature and humidity were carefully controlled. To this base, the temple priests added a bewildering array of plant and mineral substances: frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, cinnamon and cardamom from distant India, pine resin from the mountains of Lebanon, lotus flowers from the Nile Delta, and various local herbs whose psychoactive properties had been discovered through centuries of careful experimentation. But the most mysterious ingredient in Kai-Fi was something the Egyptian texts call the tears of Ra, a substance that modern scholars have been unable to identify with certainty. Some believe it was a type of tree resin that changes its psychoactive properties when exposed to sunlight. Others suggest it might have been a mineral deposit found only in certain caves in the Egyptian desert. Still others theorize that tears of Ra might not have been a single substance at all, but rather a term referring to any ingredient that had undergone a specific type of solar purification process. The preparation of Kai-Fi was as much a spiritual practice as a pharmaceutical one. The process began during the flood season, when the Nile covered the delta, a time considered sacred to the god Thoth, patron of wisdom and magic. The temple priests would gather in underground chambers, where the temperature remained constant year-round, and begin the slow process of combining and purifying the various ingredients. Each step of the preparation was accompanied by specific chants, prayers, and ritual actions designed to infuse the Kai-Fi with spiritual as well as pharmacological potency. The priests believed that the consciousness-altering effects of Kai-Fi came not just from its chemical components, but from the spiritual intentions and cosmic energies that were incorporated during its creation. The actual preparation process could take up to 4 months to complete. Ingredients were added in specific sequences determined by astronomical calculations. Some substances were combined during the new moon, others during the full moon, and still others during particular planetary alignments. The mixture was stirred with implements made from specific metals: gold for solar energy, silver for lunar energy, copper for the planet Venus. As the preparation neared completion, the Kai-Fi would be formed into small pellets or cones and allowed to age in sealed ceramic containers stored in the deepest parts of the temple complex. The aging process was crucial because the Egyptians believed that Kai-Fi continued to develop and refine its psychoactive properties over time, like wine and improving with age. When Kai-Fi was finally ready for use, its consumption was always a communal affair conducted according to strict ritual protocols. Unlike other cultures we've explored, where consciousness-altering substances were often consumed by individuals or small groups, Egyptian Kai-Fi ceremonies could involve hundreds of participants and last for several days. The largest Kai-Fi ceremonies were held during major religious festivals, particularly those celebrating the death and resurrection of Osiris. These festivals were designed to allow ordinary Egyptians, not just priests and nobility, to experience the kind of consciousness alteration that would prepare them for their own journey through death into the afterlife. The ceremony would begin at sunset with the lighting of braziers filled with Kai-Fi throughout the temple complex. As the sweet, complex smoke filled the air, participants would begin a slow procession through the temple's various chambers, each one designed to represent a different stage of the soul's journey after death. The first chamber represented the moment of physical death and the soul's separation from the body. Here, the Kai-Fi smoke was light and barely perceptible, producing subtle changes in consciousness that participants described as a gentle loosening of attachment to physical sensations and ordinary thoughts. As the procession continued through subsequent chambers, the concentration of Kai-Fi smoke increased, and the consciousness-altering effects became more pronounced. Participants reported experiencing the dissolution of individual identity, visions of deceased relatives and divine beings, and profound insights into the nature of existence and death. The central chamber of the temple represented the soul's judgment before Osiris, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Maat to determine worthiness for eternal life. Here, the Kai-Fi smoke was so thick that visibility was reduced to just a few feet, and participants often experienced what they described as complete ego dissolution, the temporary but complete loss of any sense of individual self. Many participants reported having encounters with Osiris himself during this phase of the ceremony. These weren't considered hallucinations or fantasies, but were understood as actual meetings with the god of the dead. Osiris was said to speak directly to each participant, revealing their spiritual strengths and weaknesses, and providing guidance for how to live in preparation for their eventual death. The final chamber represented the soul's resurrection and transformation into divine consciousness. Here, the Kai-Fi smoke began to clear, and participants gradually returned to ordinary awareness. But they didn't return unchanged. Egyptian texts describe people emerging from these ceremonies with profound shifts in their understanding of life, death, and their place in the cosmic order. As we continue our journey through the ancient world's consciousness-altering traditions, we find ourselves in the olive groves outside Athens, where the Mediterranean sun filters through silvery leaves and the air carries the sound of cicadas and distant temple bells. Here, in the sanctuary of Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis, we encounter perhaps the most famous and influential consciousness-altering tradition of the ancient Western world, the Eleusinian Mysteries. For over 1,000 years, from approximately 1400 BCE until 396 CE, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius closed the sanctuary as part of his campaign against pagan religions, the mysteries of Eleusis drew pilgrims from across the Greek world and beyond. Participants included some of the most famous figures in Western history: Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, and countless others who claimed that their experience at Eleusis was the most profound and transformative event of their lives. Yet despite the fame of the Eleusinian Mysteries and the thousands of people who participated in them over the centuries, we know remarkably little about what actually happened during the ceremonies. The participants were bound by sacred oaths of secrecy that they took so seriously that not a single detailed account of the central mystery has survived. This wall of silence has made Eleusis one of the most tantalizing puzzles in ancient history. What we do know is that the mysteries were based on the myth of Demeter and Persephone, the story of how Persephone was abducted by Hades, god of the underworld, causing her mother Demeter to plunge the world into eternal winter until Zeus arranged for Persephone's partial return. The myth was understood as an allegory for the cycle of death and rebirth that governs both agricultural seasons and human existence. The high priest of Eleusis, called the Hierophant, was a figure of immense authority and respect throughout the Greek world. The current Hierophant, a man named Timotheus, who has held the position for over 30 years, stands in the sacred chamber known as the Telesterion, preparing for the culmination of the greater mysteries, the ceremony that transforms ordinary mortals into mystai, those who have seen the unspeakable. The preparation for the mysteries begins months before the actual ceremony. Prospective initiates must first participate in the lesser mysteries, held in spring at a smaller sanctuary in Athens. These preparatory ceremonies involve purification rituals, instruction in the mythological background of the mysteries, and consumption of a substance called the kykeon, a barley-based drink that plays a crucial role in the full Eleusinian experience. Modern scholars have debated the nature of kykeon for decades. The ancient sources describe it as a simple mixture of barley meal, water, and mint, but many researchers believe this description conceals the presence of psychoactive ingredients. The most compelling theory, proposed by scholars like R. Gordon Wasson and Carl Ruck, suggests that the barley used in kykeon was infected with ergot, a fungus that contains compounds chemically related to LSD. This theory would explain many of the puzzling aspects of the Eleusinian Mysteries. How a simple ceremony involving the consumption of barley water could produce such profound and lasting effects on participants, why the secrecy surrounding the mysteries was so absolute, and why ancient sources consistently describe the experience as involving visions of divine beings and revelations about the nature of death and immortality. If the ergot theory is correct, then the Hierophant Timotheus is not just a religious official, but also a skilled pharmacologist who has spent decades learning how to prepare kykeon with precisely the right amount of psychoactive compounds to produce mystical experiences without causing the convulsions, gangrene, and death that can result from ergot poisoning. The actual ceremony of the greater mysteries takes place during the autumn harvest season, when the myth of Persephone's return from the underworld is most relevant. Initiates arrive at Eleusis after a day-long procession from Athens, carrying sacred objects and chanting hymns to Demeter. They have been fasting for several days and are in a heightened state of expectation and vulnerability. As night falls, the initiates are led into the Telesterion, a large hall capable of holding several thousand people. The hall is in complete darkness, except for a single torch held by the Hierophant. In this darkness, the initiates consume the kykeon and wait for the mystery to unfold. What happens next is where speculation takes over from historical knowledge. Ancient sources suggest that the ceremony involved three main elements: dromena, things done; deiknumena, things shown; and legomena, things said. But the exact nature of these elements remains unknown. Based on fragments of information from various sources, scholars have reconstructed a possible sequence of events. After consuming the kykeon, initiates would experience the onset of its consciousness-altering effects in complete darkness and silence. This phase, which could last several hours, was designed to recreate the experience of death, the loss of ordinary consciousness and identity that every human being must eventually face. Then at the climax of the ceremony, the Hierophant would dramatically reveal a brilliant light, possibly a large fire or a highly polished bronze mirror that reflected torchlight, while displaying sacred objects and speaking the central revelations of the mysteries. Initiates, under the influence of the kykeon and primed by hours of sensory deprivation, would experience this revelation as a direct encounter with the divine. Ancient sources describe initiates seeing visions of Persephone emerging from the underworld, experiencing their own death and resurrection, and receiving direct knowledge about the fate of the soul after death. Many reported that the experience completely eliminated their fear of death and gave them a profound sense of confidence about their place in the cosmic order. One of the few specific details about the content of the mysteries comes from Hippolytus, a Christian writer who claimed that at the climax of the ceremony, the Hierophant would hold up a single stalk of grain and proclaim, "In silence is the fruit harvested." This simple statement, if accurate, suggests that the central teaching of Eleusis was about the cyclical nature of life and death, and the importance of accepting both with equanimity. The psychological effects of the Eleusinian experience were apparently so profound that they could last a lifetime. Participants consistently reported that their fear of death was permanently reduced or eliminated, that they felt a deep sense of connection to the natural world and its cycles, and that they had gained direct personal knowledge of spiritual realities that no amount of philosophical reasoning could provide. The influence of the Eleusinian mysteries on ancient Greek culture was enormous. Many scholars believe that the philosophical developments of classical Greece, particularly the work of Plato on the immortality of the soul and the nature of reality, were directly influenced by the consciousness-altering experiences available at Eleusis. The confidence in reason and spiritual insight that characterized Greek philosophy may have been rooted in the direct mystical experiences that the mysteries provided. As the afternoon sun slants through the temple garden and Master Chen continues his contemplation, we turn to one of the most profound aspects of ancient consciousness-altering traditions: the understanding of plants as teachers rather than mere tools. Across the cultures we have explored, there is a consistent recognition that the plants and fungi used to alter consciousness possess their own intelligence and wisdom, and that working with them effectively requires developing a relationship based on respect, humility, and careful attention. This perspective stands in sharp contrast to the modern Western approach, which tends to view psychoactive substances as chemicals that produce predictable effects on brain function. While this mechanistic understanding has its value, the ancient traditions suggest that it misses something essential about the nature of consciousness-altering plants and the experiences they facilitate. In the Chinese tradition, cannabis was often referred to as the wise teacher, because it seemed to have the ability to show users exactly what they needed to see for their spiritual development. Experienced practitioners reported that the plant would guide them to confront specific fears, patterns of thinking, or emotional blockages that were hindering their growth. The content of these teachings was highly individual. What one person needed to learn might be completely different from what another person needed to learn, even if they consumed the same preparation at the same time. The Taoist alchemists took this understanding even further, developing elaborate theories about the spiritual intelligence of different plants and minerals. They believed that each substance had its own personality, wisdom, and preferred methods of communication. Working effectively with these plant teachers required developing the ability to listen carefully to their guidance and to respond appropriately to their teachings. This listening was not just metaphorical. Practitioners reported actually hearing voices, receiving visual messages, or experiencing direct transmission of knowledge that seemed to come from the plants themselves rather than from their own minds. Modern psychology might explain these experiences as projections of unconscious wisdom, but the ancient practitioners took them literally as communications from intelligent beings that existed in plant form. The Persian hashish tradition also emphasized the teaching function of consciousness-altering plants. The scholars who gathered in houses of contemplation believed that hashish had the ability to dissolve the mental barriers that normally prevent humans from accessing deeper levels of knowledge and insight. But they also believed that the plant was an active participant in this process, choosing what to reveal and when to reveal it based on the spiritual readiness and needs of the individual practitioner. This understanding led to the development of sophisticated protocols for working with plant teachers that emphasized preparation, intention, and integration. Before consuming any consciousness-altering substance, practitioners would spend considerable time clarifying their intentions, examining their motivations, and preparing their minds and hearts to receive whatever teachings the plant might offer. The intention-setting process was particularly important because it was believed to influence what kind of teachings the plant would provide. A person approaching cannabis with genuine spiritual curiosity might receive profound insights about the nature of reality. Someone approaching it with selfish or trivial intentions might experience confusion, anxiety, or simply recreational effects without deeper meaning. Similarly, the integration process, after consuming plant medicines, was considered crucial for actualizing whatever teachings had been received. Practitioners would spend days or weeks contemplating their experiences, discussing them with experienced guides and finding ways to apply any insights to their daily lives and spiritual practices. The Egyptian Kaifi tradition exemplified this approach to plant teachers on a collective scale. The elaborate temple ceremonies we explored earlier were designed not just to provide individuals with consciousness-altering experiences, but to facilitate communication between the community and the plant intelligences that were believed to govern natural cycles and cosmic processes. The priests who prepared and administered Kaifi saw themselves as intermediaries between human consciousness and the vast intelligence that they believed pervaded the natural world. They understood their role not as controlling or manipulating consciousness-altering substances, but as creating optimal conditions for communication between human and plant consciousness to occur. This perspective led to remarkably sophisticated understanding of what modern researchers call set and setting, the psychological and environmental factors that influence consciousness-altering experiences. The ancient Egyptians knew that the same substance could produce completely different effects, depending on the mental state of the user, the physical environment, the social context, and the ceremonial framework within which consumption occurred. They developed elaborate methods for optimizing all of these factors to maximize the likelihood of beneficial experiences and minimize the risk of difficult or harmful ones. The temple spaces were designed according to principles that enhanced consciousness alteration. The timing of ceremonies was calculated to coincide with optimal astronomical and seasonal conditions. The preparation of participants included psychological counseling, spiritual guidance, and careful assessment of individual readiness. Perhaps most importantly, the entire process was embedded in a worldview that saw consciousness-altering experiences as opportunities for learning and growth rather than simply as novel or entertaining states of mind. This framework gave participants a context for understanding and integrating whatever they experienced, reducing the likelihood that they would be overwhelmed or confused by the intensity of altered consciousness. The Greek Eleusinian tradition took this educational approach to consciousness alteration to its logical conclusion by making participation in the mysteries a prerequisite for full citizenship in Athenian society. The Greeks believed that the insights available through consciousness-altering experiences were so important for human development that everyone should have access to them, regardless of social class or background. This democratic approach to consciousness alteration was unusual in the ancient world, where access to mind-altering substances was often restricted to priests, nobility, or other elite groups. The Eleusinian mysteries were open to anyone who could speak Greek and had not committed murder, requirements that excluded relatively few people from participation. The Norse berserker tradition represents a different but equally sophisticated understanding of plant teachers. The Amanita muscaria mushrooms used by these warriors were understood not just as tools for enhancing combat effectiveness, but as spiritual allies that could facilitate transformation from ordinary human consciousness to animal consciousness. This transformation was not seen as a loss of human intelligence or awareness, but as access to forms of knowledge and ability that were normally unavailable to human consciousness. The animal spirits that possessed berserkers were believed to possess their own wisdom. The bear's understanding of strength and endurance, the wolf's knowledge of pack tactics and loyalty, the boar's insights into courage and determination. Working with these plant allies required developing relationships with animal spirits that could take years to establish fully. Young warriors would often spend months in wilderness settings, fasting and meditating in the presence of the animals whose spirits they hoped to embody. They would study animal behavior carefully, learning to think and move in ways that aligned with their chosen animal spirit. This preparation was considered essential because the mushroom could only facilitate connection with animal consciousness. It could not create that connection without proper groundwork. Warriors who attempted to use Amanita muscaria without adequate preparation often experienced confusion, loss of control, or even dangerous behavioral changes rather than the focused animal consciousness that characterized effective berserkers. As evening approaches and the temple garden fills with the gentle sounds of nocturnal insects beginning their chorus, Master Chen reflects on one of the most important lessons that emerges from our survey of ancient consciousness-altering traditions: the critical importance of preparation. Across all the cultures we have explored, successful work with consciousness-altering substances required extensive preparation of mind, body, and environment. This emphasis on preparation stands in sharp contrast to the casual, often impulsive way that consciousness-altering substances are frequently used in modern contexts. The ancient practitioners understood that the state of consciousness one brings to the experience largely determines what kind of experience one will have. Approaching these substances without proper preparation was like trying to read a book in a foreign language without first learning the alphabet. Possible, perhaps, but unlikely to yield meaningful results. The Chinese Taoist tradition exemplified this understanding through their elaborate protocols for preparing both the substance and the practitioner. We have seen how the creation of consciousness-altering elixirs could take months or even years, with each step of the process requiring careful attention to timing, intention, and cosmic conditions. But equally important was the preparation of the person who would eventually consume the elixir. This preparation typically began with what the Taoists called purification of the three treasures: body, energy, and mind. Physical purification involved dietary changes, exercise practices, and sometimes fasting to optimize the body's ability to process consciousness, altering substances safely and effectively. Many practitioners would adopt vegetarian diets for weeks or months before consuming powerful elixirs, believing that animal products could interfere with the subtle energetic effects of plant medicines. Energetic purification involved breathing practices, movement exercises, and meditation techniques designed to balance and harmonize the body's energy systems. The Taoists believed that consciousness-altering substances worked primarily through their effects on subtle energy rather than through gross physical mechanisms. Preparing the energy body through qigong and other practices was therefore considered essential for maximizing beneficial effects. Mental purification was perhaps the most complex aspect of Taoist preparation. It involved examining one's motivations for seeking consciousness alteration, resolving psychological conflicts that might interfere with the experience, and cultivating specific mental qualities like patience, humility, and openness to unexpected teachings. This mental preparation often included studying classical texts that described various types of consciousness, altering experiences, and the insights that could be gained from them. Practitioners would memorize poetry and philosophical passages that could serve as anchors during intense experiences, providing familiar reference points when ordinary consciousness became disrupted. The Persian hashish tradition placed similar emphasis on preparation, but with a focus that was more intellectual and philosophical. Participants in consciousness-altering ceremonies were expected to have mastered significant bodies of knowledge in poetry, mathematics, theology, and natural philosophy before they were considered ready for hashish experiences. This educational preparation served several purposes. First, it ensured that participants had conceptual frameworks for understanding and integrating whatever insights they might gain during altered states. Second, it provided a foundation of shared knowledge that facilitated meaningful communication between participants during group experiences. Third, it demonstrated the seriousness of purpose and commitment to learning that Persian masters considered essential for beneficial work with consciousness-altering substances. The Persian preparation process also included what they called ethical purification, a systematic examination of one's moral character and behavior patterns. Participants were expected to identify and address character flaws, like greed, anger, pride, or dishonesty, that might distort their perception during consciousness-altering experiences. The idea was that these mental impurities could act like filters that prevented clear perception of spiritual truths. This ethical preparation was not just a matter of following external rules or commandments, but involved developing genuine insight into the nature of ethical behaviour and its relationship to consciousness. Participants would spend considerable time studying ethical philosophy, examining their own behaviour patterns, and working to cultivate virtues like compassion, honesty, and humility. The Egyptian Kai-Fi tradition demonstrated the importance of collective preparation for consciousness-altering experiences. The elaborate festivals during which Kai-Fi was consumed required months of preparation by entire communities. This preparation involved not just the creation of the Kai-Fi itself, but the coordination of music, art, architecture, and ceremonial elements that would create optimal conditions for collective consciousness alteration. The community preparation process served to build shared understanding and intention among participants, reducing the likelihood of conflicts or misunderstandings that could disrupt the collective experience. It also created a sense of sacred purpose that helped participants approach the experience with appropriate reverence and seriousness. Individual preparation for Egyptian Kai-Fi ceremonies involved similar elements to those we have seen in other traditions: dietary purification, meditation practice, study of relevant texts and teachings. But it also included specific preparation for the collective nature of the experience, including practice with group meditation, chanting, and ceremonial movement. The Greek Eleusinian tradition perhaps best exemplified the integration of individual and collective preparation. The lesser mysteries, held months before the greater mysteries, served as a comprehensive preparation program that addressed physical, psychological, and spiritual readiness for the profound consciousness-altering experience that awaited initiates at Eleusis. This preparation included not just consumption of preliminary versions of the Kaikion, but extensive education about Greek mythology, philosophy, and religious practices. Initiates learned to understand their personal psychological material in the context of universal mythological patterns, providing a framework for interpreting whatever they might experience during the greater mysteries. The Norse Berserker tradition took a completely different approach to preparation, focusing primarily on physical and psychological conditioning for the extreme states of consciousness required for effective combat performance. This preparation involved not just training with weapons and tactics, but systematic exposure to pain, discomfort, and psychological stress designed to build tolerance for the intensity of berserker consciousness. Young warriors would undergo vision quests in wilderness settings, spending days or weeks alone with minimal food and shelter, while consuming small amounts of Amanita muscaria and learning to navigate the altered states it produced. These experiences served both as preparation for full berserker initiation and as opportunities to establish relationships with the animal spirits that would later possess them during battle. The physical preparation for berserker transformation included not just weapons training, but specific exercises designed to build the kind of explosive strength and endurance that characterized berserker combat performance. Warriors would practice fighting while exhausted, injured, or under the influence of various consciousness-altering substances, learning to maintain tactical effectiveness even when ordinary consciousness was severely disrupted. As our journey through the consciousness-altering traditions of the ancient world nears its end, and the evening stars begin to appear above the temple garden where Master Chen continues his meditation, we arrive at perhaps the most important aspect of these traditions: the process of integration. It was never enough simply to have consciousness-altering experiences. The real value lay in translating the insights gained during altered states into practical wisdom that could enhance one's effectiveness in ordinary life. Master Chen, now in the final years of his long life, embodies this integration. His decades of experience with consciousness-altering practices have not made him otherworldly or detached from practical concerns. Instead, they have given him a quality of presence and wisdom that allows him to engage more fully and effectively with whatever circumstances arise. When asked about the most important lesson he has learned from his lifetime of studying consciousness alteration, Master Chen's answer is characteristically simple and profound. The purpose of changing consciousness is not to escape from life, but to understand life more clearly. Any practice that takes you away from the compassionate engagements with the world has missed the point. This perspective reflects a common thread that runs through all the authentic consciousness-altering traditions we have explored. Whether we look at Chinese Taoism, Persian mysticism, Egyptian temple practices, Greek mystery religions, or Norse shamanism, we find the same basic understanding. Consciousness alteration is a tool for enhancing human potential, not for escaping human responsibility. The Chinese Taoist tradition emphasized integration through what they called bringing heaven to earth, the process of manifesting spiritual insights in practical action. Practitioners who had achieved profound realizations during consciousness-altering experiences were expected to apply those insights to governance, scholarship, artistic creation, or other forms of service to society. The greatest Taoist sages were often simultaneously mystics and practical administrators, poets and farmers, philosophers and healers. Their consciousness-altering practices enhanced rather than diminished their effectiveness in worldly affairs. The insights gained during altered states informed their decision-making, their relationships, and their creative work. This integration was facilitated by specific practices designed to maintain connection with expanded consciousness even during ordinary activities. These included meditation techniques that could be practiced while working, breathing exercises that could be done throughout the day, and ways of perceiving ordinary experiences as expressions of the same cosmic principles revealed during consciousness-altering experiences. The Persian tradition approached integration through what they called the marriage of wine and wisdom, the synthesis of mystical insight with intellectual understanding. Participants in hashish ceremonies were expected to translate their experiences into poetry, philosophy, and scholarly discourse that could benefit the broader intellectual community. Many of the greatest works of Persian literature and philosophy were directly inspired by consciousness-altering experiences. The poets Hafez and Rumi, the philosopher Ibn Sina, and countless other figures drew upon insights gained during altered states to create works that have influenced human culture for centuries. But this creative output was not seen as the end goal of consciousness alteration. Instead, it was understood as one way of sharing the insights gained during mystical experiences with those who had not had such experiences themselves. The ultimate purpose was to raise the level of consciousness and understanding throughout society. The Egyptian tradition emphasized integration through what they called living as the dead, conducting oneself in ordinary life with the perspective gained from experiences of ego dissolution and cosmic consciousness. Participants in Kaifi ceremonies returned to their daily activities with reduced fear of death, enhanced appreciation for the interconnectedness of all life, and greater clarity about what was truly important. This shifted perspective had practical implications for how people made decisions, related to others, and allocated their time and energy. Many reported becoming less concerned with social status and material accumulation, while becoming more focused on relationships, creative expression, and spiritual development. The Egyptian integration process also included specific practices for maintaining connection with the insights gained during temple ceremonies. These included daily meditation practices, regular participation in community rituals, an ongoing study of the mythological and philosophical frameworks that provided context for understanding consciousness-altering experiences. The Greek tradition approached integration through what they called philosophical living, the application of insights gained at Eleusis to the pursuit of wisdom, virtue, and truth in daily life. Many of the greatest Greek philosophers credited their participation in the Eleusinian mysteries with providing the experiential foundation for their theoretical understanding. Plato's theory of forms, for example, can be understood as an attempt to describe, in rational language, the direct perception of archetypal realities that was available during consciousness-altering experiences. His allegory of the cave metaphorically describes the relationship between ordinary consciousness and the expanded awareness that could be accessed through mystery initiation. The Greek integration process emphasized the complementary relationship between rational thought and mystical experience. Neither was considered sufficient by itself. Reason, without mystical insight, led to dry intellectualism, while mystical experience without rational integration led to confused emotionalism. The Norse tradition took a completely different approach to integration, focusing on the embodiment of animal wisdom in human activities. Warriors who had learned to access bear, wolf, or boar consciousness during berserker experiences were expected to manifest the virtues of these animals, strength, loyalty, courage, in their daily conduct. This integration extended far beyond combat situations. A warrior who had developed a relationship with bear consciousness might become known for his protectiveness toward his community and his ability to endure hardship without complaint. Someone connected with wolf consciousness might demonstrate exceptional loyalty to his companions and skill in cooperative endeavors. The Norse understanding was that consciousness-altering experiences with Amanita muscaria provided access to forms of wisdom that were normally unavailable to human consciousness. But this wisdom was only valuable if it could be integrated into human life in ways that enhanced individual and collective flourishing. As Master Chen rises from his meditation and begins to make his way back toward the temple buildings, his movements embody the integration of a lifetime's worth of consciousness-altering experiences. He walks with deliberate awareness, fully present to each step, each breath, each sensation. His awareness is both focused and spacious, attending to immediate details while remaining open to the larger patterns of which those details are part. This quality of integrated awareness represents the ultimate goal of all authentic consciousness-altering practices. Not the dramatic experiences themselves, but the gradual transformation of ordinary consciousness that results from skillful work with those experiences over time. The ancient traditions we have explored offer valuable guidance for anyone interested in consciousness alteration, whether through meditation, plant medicines, or other practices. They remind us that the most important questions are not about which substances to use or how to intensify experiences, but about how to approach consciousness alteration with appropriate intention, preparation, and commitment to integration. They also remind us that consciousness alteration is not a purely individual pursuit, but one that has implications for our relationships, our communities, and our society. The insights gained through expanded awareness carry with them responsibility for contributing to the well-being of all life. As we conclude our journey through these ancient traditions, perhaps the most important lesson is that consciousness alteration, at its best, is not about escape from the human condition, but about embracing it more fully. It is about developing the kind of awareness that allows us to respond to life's challenges with greater wisdom, compassion, and skill. The ancient practitioners understood that changing consciousness was ultimately about changing how we live, Not just what we experience during altered states, but how we engage with the world during ordinary consciousness. Their traditions offer timeless wisdom for anyone seeking to explore the vast potential of human awareness while remaining grounded in ethical conduct and service to others. And so, as the night deepens over the temple garden and the sounds of the nocturnal world begin their ancient symphony, we honour these traditions not as museum pieces from a distant past, but as living sources of wisdom that continue to offer guidance for the expansion of human consciousness and the cultivation of wisdom in our own time. The path they illuminated remains open to anyone willing to approach it with the same seriousness, dedication, and ethical commitment that characterized the ancient practitioners. In walking that path, we join an unbroken lineage of human beings who have sought to understand the deepest mysteries of consciousness, cosmos, and the sacred nature of existence itself. Word count approximately 15,000 words. Let your breathing slow as these ancient stories settle into your mind like sediment in still water. The wisdom of millennia whispers through these tales of plant teachers and sacred preparations, of seekers who looked beyond ordinary consciousness and found something eternal waiting there. Rest now, and perhaps in your dreams, you too might walk in those ancient gardens where consciousness and cosmos dance together in the timeless rhythm of awakening.